the record, one of our organizers has a birthday today, which is Ido. Congratulations, Ido. I hope you continue to publish many articles and you choose your co-authors wisely.
Yeah.
Oh,
thanks.
Yes. Okay. So I think we are on time. Sorry.
Yes, yes.
So I think we can start. So I would very shortly introduce Professor Yael Niv, who is a neuroscientist, and she studies reinforcement learning and decision making. She's a prominent scholar. She has received numerous highly prestigious awards, for example, the Sutherland Research Award, and has many publications in very prestigious journals. So now what we are going to work in this I'm sorry. So now we will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have about 15 minutes for questions, and then those who will have to go will go, and if it's fine with you, we will stay for another 10 to 15 minutes for those who want to ask additional questions. Is it fine with you, Yael?
Yeah, sounds good. I thought the whole thing was longer, so this is I'm getting a positive prediction error here.
So you know what, 45 minutes or even 50 minutes, take your time.
That's good. No, it's a positive
I think you need
error.
to make Yael a co-host. Okay.
Yes, I did it. You can do it.
Okay.
Even better.
So let me share screen. What do I want to share? I want to share this. I think this will work.
No rush. I think it's 49 minutes left.
Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to share. Sorry. I knew that there was some trick to giving talks from home. It's been a while. Portion of the screen. Let me do set the size. Okay, so I'm setting the size here. I can also see you, your lovely faces on the side. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, virtual or real, during the talk as well. So let me just move this. I move this. Yes. So you see everything fine, right? Great.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks so much for inviting me, and it's nice to see all these familiar faces and those who are new. So as you look at this image of my lab, you might immediately infer that we took the photo in the height of the COVID pandemic. And this is a form of latent cause inference. So you're inferring some unobservable cause for observable events, for seeing us all wearing masks. And this is something that we do on a daily basis. Basically, like as you're thinking, will this be a good talk? There are many causes, some of them latent, hidden, some of them not, that might affect your predictions. So you might consider the speaker. Maybe you've heard talks by me in the past, maybe you know me personally, maybe you know work from my lab. You might have read the abstract and found that it's relevant to your work, so the topic. And some of these causes are shared with other talks. So maybe you've been to the seminar series before and you know the quality of speakers that are usually invited and that it's worth waking up at 7 a.m. in Bloomington, Indiana for this. So this is basically your generative model of the talk. So as you are planning whether to tune in or not, you have all of these aspects informing you on whether you estimate this would be a talk that's worth your time. And so this lets you make a prediction and choose your actions accordingly. And it's also the other way around. So after you've experienced my talk, which I hope you'll think that was good, then you can update not only the value of this particular talk, because you'll never hear this particular talk again, so that's not really relevant, but you can update what you think about me, about my lab, about the topic of research, about this whole seminar series, etc. And so the idea that I'm going to talk about today is that we automatically, as we're learning and experiencing the world, we infer latent causes that help us group experiences and generalize across them. And latent causes here in quotes, and I can get to that again later, that it doesn't have to be true causes, true causal structure. It's really grouping that allows us it could be grouping by similarity that allows us to make predictions and learn effectively, because really all of learning is generalization, right? We never experience the exact same thing twice. So the big question really is where to set the boundaries. When I'm making a prediction right now, what experiences in the past are similar enough to the situation that I should draw on them to make a prediction? And of course, Ido and others here have worked on this kind of formalization for a long time, of drawing from memory through similarity. And here, I'm not just thinking of sampling from memory, but really how we organize our learning and how we organize our memories to start with. And so here's one example that illustrates animals learning latent causes. So think of a really simple paradigm, fear conditioning. So in fear conditioning, you can teach an animal that, let's say, a tone that it hears predicts a foot shock that it gets through this grid. It's very fast learning. You can do this 2-3 times, and the animal will have learned this association so that when you play the tone, the animal already shows a fear response, so it freezes, expecting the shock. And now you can extinguish this association by playing the tone many times without the shock. So according to reinforcement learning, this should cause learning through a prediction error, right? So the animal is predicting a shock, but not getting a shock. So there's a prediction error, and that should change the value, let's say, of the tone or what the tone predicts. But what we see instead is at test, and you can test, let's say, in the same context as extinction. So here I've marked the context as different, like, different colored boxes. But you can think of other markers of context, for instance, temporal context. And I'll get to that in a second too. So you can test literally in the same box that extinction happened, or you can test in the acquisition context, or you can test in a completely new context. And what has been shown again and again, and this is called renewal of fear, is that if you test in the acquisition context, the animal freezes a lot more than if you test in the extinction context. And this might seem completely trivial when we think phenomenologically about this, but the model does not predict this, right? Reinforcement learning predicted that in extinction, the value of the tone changed. If the value of the tone is now lower, so it predicts less shock or predicts shock with less probability or something like that, the model can't explain why that fear comes back when you test in the acquisition context. And so this is not anything new. This is known for 100 years and more, that extinction doesn't really erase old associations. And the idea, the story here is that in extinction, animals learn something new. They learn a new association that competes with the old association and maybe wins in some situations, like if you're in the purple context here, and loses if you're in an orange context. And in a new context, maybe it's kind of half-half. So this is a kind of explanation of what is happening, but it still raises the question, if we're thinking in terms of modeling and formally, how does the animal know to start a new association when extinction starts? Why didn't it start a new association between trials 2 and 3 in acquisition? And so the idea that I'm posing here is that dissimilarity, for instance, being in a different context, for instance, not getting shocks, are cues for starting a new latent cause. And it could be completely latent, could be in the same exact box. Extinction, if you extinguish in the same exact boxes in acquisition, still the animal learns a new association. We know that because that association, for instance, recovers over time. So if you just wait long enough, extinction will recover. That's called spontaneous recovery. You can also give, if you are impatient and don't want to wait, you can give a reminder shock or reminder unconditioned stimulus. So a reminder shock, and you'll see that the fear comes back. So the fear is there. It was not unlearned in extinction, even if extinction is in the same exact box. And the idea is that that's a latent cause that the animal is inferring, a new latent cause. So in general, if we think of this latent cause framework, this raises two problems. One is, how do animals infer when a new latent cause starts? So how do they learn a latent cause representation for new situations, new tasks? And two, how do they infer the current latent cause at any point in time? And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. And the talk has 5 parts, although we might not get through all of them. First, I'm going to show you a Bayesian framework that addresses both of these problems. This is called the Chinese restaurant process prior. Then I'll show you, I'm going to take you to the farthest prediction of this theory that we've tested so far. So we've tested a lot of predictions in the realm of learning and memory, but I'm going to show you one that has to do with social evaluation. Then I'll show you some results from directly measuring this latent cause inference process in humans. And then I'm going to go back to extinction and what I just talked about and how to make extinction more effective. And this is a prediction from the model that we have tested in animals. And finally, I'll discuss, if we get to it, some dimensions of individual variability in this process. So why might extinction work for some people and fail for other people? And this is relevant. I'm now, I'm on sabbatical in Israel, and I'm actually immersed in clinical work. I'm at Geha most days of the week. Today I was already there. And in situations such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, addiction, and in general, a lot of therapy, exposure therapy, is about learning something new. And often we want that new learning to override old learning. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so we're studying individual variability in this learning process and how to predict who it will succeed for. Okay, so first, the model. So the idea that Sam Gershman, who was a long time ago student in my lab, he's by now, I believe, tenured faculty. So this is a really long time ago. His idea was that when we think of associations, we tend to think about associations between observable events. So for instance, between a tone and a shock. But assuming that the animal learns this is a little bit of underestimating what animals might learn, because this isn't the true causal structure even in the environment, right? The tone did not cause the shock. In fact, there was a latent cause, the program that the experimenter wrote, that caused both the shock and the tone. And so animals might be inferring latent causes. And when we think of our own learning, we infer latent causes all the time, you know, from gravity to just, you know, there are lots of different things that we have no problem assuming effects of, even though we've never seen them with our very eyes. And so if we think of animals learning about latent causes, of course, the question is, you know, how to keep that model parsimonious, because you can assume one latent cause, you can assume 2 latent causes that happen to be active at the same time. You could assume 7 latent causes, several of them together causing a tone. It becomes really unconstrained. And so we wanted to use a constrained model that allows learning in complex scenarios. So it's a flexible model, but it also tries to learn the most parsimonious explanation for observed data. And so we found that in Bayesian inference with what's called an infinite capacity prior, or a Chinese restaurant process prior, infinite mixture model. Lots of names for basically one equation. The idea here is that observations, is that the animal assumes that observations are caused by latent causes. I mean, they might be observable, they might be, you know, but there are some causes that I'll call them latent. And in terms of the animal's prior belief, all else equal, so prior belief, before it sees any observations, before it sees kind of the next instance, next trial, let's say, it assumes that whatever happened most commonly in the past is more likely to happen next, right? This makes sense. So a prolific latent cause, a latent cause that caused more events in the past, is more likely to cause the next observation before I've seen anything. So this makes the model try to be parsimonious and to say, if the next observation is similar enough to things I've seen in the past, I'm going to assume that it's the same as what I've seen in the past, comes from the same latent cause. Or this is going to help it assume that. It doesn't make it do that yet. The second part of the model is we want it to be flexible enough and generative. And so here, the assumption is that the number of possible latent causes is unbounded. So although the most prolific latent cause is more likely to cause another observation, there's always some probability for a new latent cause. So this is the one equation that represents this prior belief. So the probability that the cause of trial T is cause number K, K is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is proportional to NK, the number of events already caused by cause K. But there is a small probability alpha for a completely new latent cause that is obviously caused 0 previously. So its N is 0. That's why I'm putting alpha here instead of 0. Does that make sense? So this is the prior. And then Bayesian inference, you multiply your prior belief by the likelihood. The likelihood comes from seeing the observation and assessing how likely it is to have come from each of the latent causes that you have previously inferred. And the idea here is simple. Depending on the experiment, you put a different likelihood function here, but the general idea is that each latent cause tends to produce similar events. So it could be, a Gaussian with some mean. If you're looking at continuous stuff, it depends on the observations and whether they're binary, continuous, etc. But basically, this explains why. So this is a simulation of the model, and these are the results I showed you before. Why why fear recovers in the acquisition latent cause compared to the extinction latent cause. And the idea is that in acquisition, animals inferred one latent cause. In extinction, they inferred a different one because things were different enough. Here, the box was different, there were no shocks, so lots of differences that make it less likely that these trials come from this latent cause. So that alpha, that probability of a new latent cause 1 over and a new latent cause was inferred. And then at test, when we put the animal back in the orange box, given the box and given the tone, it's more likely that this latent cause is causing this trial. So there's going to be a shock than this latent cause, then Y. There's also a possibility of a completely new third latent cause, which is also what happens if you put the animal in a green box, in a completely new box, that becomes even more likely. So I mentioned before that when I call this latent causes, but it doesn't have to be the actual causal structure. It could be grouping through time. So what people call context. It could be grouping, clustering through any dimension of similarity. I like the fact that all of these cause, context, and cluster all start with C. So we can just call it C and not really commit to whichever one it is. They're all fine. Questions at this point? Okay, so one more thing before we move on from the model to the experiments. So I want to be really, because there are modelers here, I want to be really clear about what this model is and what it is not, because it's like any model that's a specific simple equation, it doesn't do everything, it does some things. So this is a model, this is called the stick breaking process. It's a model of a static partitioning of all of the data into latent causes. So we don't know how many latent causes there are to start with, but this is not a model of change over time. It's a model of there are a certain number of unknown latent causes and I'm sampling from them, and order is actually irrelevant. This model as written is order invariant. I'm sampling from latent causes, and the more I sample, the more likely it is that I've seen all the latent causes there are in the world. And that's why this probability, because T grows with time, the probability of a new latent cause becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So obviously this is not a good model for the real world, because we live in environments that change, and the probability of change does not become smaller over time. As all of us who have lived through the huge change of the world to email and smartphones and stuff, we know that the world does not stop changing. So there are some modifications that you can make to this model to make it a better fit for changing environments. So for instance, there is something called the distance-dependent Chinese restaurant process by David Bly and Fraser, I forget his first name. There is the persistent Chinese restaurant process. in the studies that I will show you, we're using the persistent Chinese restaurant process to model this. And what the persistent Chinese restaurant process does is it says there is some probability that whatever latent cause happened in the last trial is going to be is going to persist to this trial. And only 1 minus that probability I draw from this prior. And when we talk about individual differences, of course, people can have a different parameter for how persistent latent causes are. So how likely is change in the world? I also want to say that this is not really a model of change either. It's not a proper model of change. So I'm just flagging this as future work for someone who wants to dive into this. Nobody has yet written a really good model of change here with like constant probability of change. Okay. So questions about the model before I move on? Okay, they're a great audience. So I'm claiming here, without proving to you yet, that grouping by similarity is fundamental to learning. I kind of think it's one of these things that once you start thinking about learning and what it really means and how, it's all generalization, it's almost tautological. We have to group things somehow. Otherwise, we would not be able to learn. So instead of showing you a whole bunch of very old experiments that establish this in different domains, what I want to show you is, how far we've taken this theory. From the obvious perception and memory, we've gone to social evaluation. And here, this is work by Yun-Soon Shin, who was a graduate student in my lab. She graduated in the middle of pandemic and is now a postdoc in Molly Crockett's lab. And she was really interested in stereotyping and social evaluations. And when reading about stereotyping, she came again and again across this phenomenon called negativity bias. So it seems that negative actions loom very large in our social evaluations. And so she was thinking, why is that? And in thinking about that, she had the idea that it might be because of something like this quote from Anna Karenina: happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And what Yun-Soon was thinking is that maybe negative things are just more different from each other. So basically they get assigned to more latent causes. So imagine a colleague at work, and they're mostly nice and helpful. So lots of things that come out of the good cause. They open the door, they hold the door for you when you're coming in, they smile, etc. But once in a while, they disappoint you. So maybe once in a meeting, they fail to speak on your behalf when, someone was saying something bad about you, they didn't kind of support you. Maybe another time they spoke over you. So when you were speaking, they were rude and spoke over you. And maybe once you heard them gossiping about you. And so when you're putting these things in memory, you might organize them by latent causes. And even when I was saying these words, I said, they're a gossip, they're rude, they are disappointing or, unreliable. So we have a lot of words for these different events that you encountered. And they're nice and they smile and they, things like that. So we have kind of not many words to describe all the many instances. And it's not just an issue of words. It's, there might have been many instances of them smiling at you in the morning, but you assume that just comes from the fact that they're a smiley person, often in a good mood. So if you store your experiences in this way, so imagine now I ask you, how is this, colleague at work, what do you think about them? Now, assuming that to evaluate that, you don't draw on the actual instances, but you might draw on the latent causes, like all of these high-level memories that I have about this person. And you might average them, not weighing correctly how much evidence there is behind each latent cause. Let's say you have, like a Weber's law, diminishing weights on these latent causes, then this would cause you to overemphasize the bad things, because eventually these would be overweighted and these would be underweighted. And so this was the idea. And so to test this, what Yun-Soon did is she gave people, these were online experiments, she gave people situations in which they were told that they were logging donations. So they're at a school and they're collecting donations for a worthy cause, and they see Gregory donated 78 coins. There are actually 78 coins here, and they just have to, on this bar that says, you know, I can't really see here, 30, 60, 90, 120, they have to log 78. They have to move it to 78. And then they see the next person, Jeff donated 82, and they have to move that to 82. It's a very boring experiment. They're just looking at all these numbers. So we ask them to log them just to make sure that they pay attention. And then at the very end of the experiment, we have one piece of data from them. We just ask them, what was the average donation? That's it. And we had subjects here in two groups. One group we call the sparse stingy group, where most of the donations are generous, above 150, and a few donations are below 150. They're set so that the true average is 150. That's the true average donation. And the sparse generous group is the exact same, just reversed. And so our hypothesis was that here people would guess above 150 when we ask them what is the average donation, and here they would guess below 150. We did this in many different variants. So there are all kinds of alternative explanations. So you might say the fact that there are many more, that there are much fewer events here means that they stand out in memory in a specific way. So here we have the same number of stingy events as generous events, but the stingy are kind of more sparse in that they're more spread apart. They're less similar to each other than the generous ones. And we also looked at the actual sequence to make sure that if we set the sequence so that if they do recency weighted average, that would push them away from our hypothesis, not towards our hypothesis. And we compared to a reinforcement learning model, a general reinforcement learning model, which is basically recency weighted average, and a whole bunch of other controls. And basically in every case, so there's 6 experiments here, and there was one last experiment that had the N of all of these combined, thanks to a reviewer who wanted us to be really, really sure about our result. In all cases, we see that people's estimate is biased towards the side that was sparse. It doesn't matter if that's a positive or the generous donations or the stingy donations.
The model, yeah, how the model explained that by the fact that if you have many observations, the same, you think it's the same latent variable, and then the frequency of the latent variable.
It's not the many, it's a similar. If you have a bunch of similar donations, you put them in one latent cause. And if you have less similar donations, they're just farther apart, you assume you have more latent causes. Maybe like, if you think about it here, I can do the second one, like, the ones who donated about 125, the ones who donated about 150, the ones who donated about, you have these memories in your head that there were, a bunch in each of these, and there were a bunch around 300, but that bunch might be, if it's not weighted exactly by the amount. Let's say here, that there were like 3 or 4 of each, but here there were like, a lot. 20, 15, a lot, some number that's not the exact one and not high enough, then you'll end up weighting these latent causes more heavily. So it all hinges here on the number of latent causes on each side.
I'm thinking maybe we'll talk about that during the discussion, but all the underweighting of rare events phenomenon, I would assume that if you have this latent, so it will not, how can it explain the underweighting? But let's talk about that later on. This is very cool results because all the models predict otherwise, right? So
I'm not sure all the models predict otherwise. I mean, we know that people remember outliers. So this is another explanation for remembering outliers. And also we have other experiments that I'm not going to show you today about literally about memory, about recognition memory. And we know that events that have a higher prediction error, so they're less expected by everything else. And you can think of latent causes causing an expectation because you expect the next event to come, to come from that latent cause, and that latent cause has created, events with a mean of 300, donations of 300, that's what you're expecting for the next event. When you have large prediction errors, we know that you have better recognition memory for those events as well.
And we have results that distinguish between choice and judgment. And in judgment, we don't see underrating of error event. We only get it in choice. So it might be
I see. You're thinking about the fact that, okay, if a rare event happened a long time ago, you might underweight it. Yeah. This is also not close to 0 and 100 here. We're in the middle, right, of the, Hammond-Tversky nonlinear functions. Okay. Yes.
Just to clarify, you never asked, or you don't have experience in which the same information is given, and then you ask them to maybe choose which of these. So maybe choose between these different scenarios. Which would they prefer if they had to select just one, and then?
Not in that experiment. Not in that experiment. One thing that we did do in that experiment is the variant. One of the control variants that we ran is after every trial, we asked them to estimate the average, so they can update it trial by trial. And there, they had no bias. So people know how to do recency weighted averaging. It's more that if you don't ask them to estimate it all at once, but after 100 trials, or I can't remember how many trials there were, 60 trials, you ask them to kind of draw from memory, then you see this bias. But we didn't ask them to choose. I don't know what they would choose from. They only saw like one school with donations, so there's not much to choose from. We would have to show them 2 schools, one with a higher and one with lower, and then give them a choice. We didn't do that.
But Yael, theoretically, your model predicts the same thing with choice. I think that's the maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
So that should be an interesting thing to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, I think what Ito was saying is that there's a distinction between choice and judgment, and then the judgment would be just as you predict, and then the choice would be reversed. And this is interesting prediction.
Yeah, we have results like that we can try to relate our result to the freak-end effect by Kahneman. And in the freak-end, we get it for judgment, but in choice, it's reverse. But we can talk about it later. Let's continue.
Okay, so part 3. So, this is some other references to work that we've done on perception on memory with latent cause inference. But what I want to show you now is newer data. It's not yet published from measuring latent cause inference process directly in humans. And this is this is the contrast to the previous task. In the previous task, we measured nothing about the process. We just asked them something at the very end. We can't model, any individual differences there because we have one number per subject. Here we're doing exactly the opposite. What we're doing is, so this is work by Sarah Dubrow, Yunsun Shin, and Dan Mirsamira. Sarah was a postdoc in my lab and then had her own lab in University of Oregon. And she passed away from horrible cancer earlier this year. We miss her very much. And Dan is a grad student in my lab now. And what they designed, actually, Yunsun and Sarah designed this task, Dan joined afterwards, is a task that looks like this. So we show people microbes that are a circle with spikes. I swear we designed this before the COVID pandemic. We actually had to halt the experiment when COVID started because it was a little bit too stressful for people, but by now we can continue. And these, we tell subjects that they're microbiologists and that they took pictures of microbes in different locations, and different locations have different strains, and different strains are different in the length of the spikes and the number of the spikes. But the labels on the photos got lost, and some photos also went out of order. And so now they're going to see photos of microbes, and they just have to say which strain they're from. So the first one obviously is from the first strain. Then they see the second one. Is it still that first strain, or is this already the second strain, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're literally telling us what latent cause, the strain is the latent cause they are inferring. And behind the scenes, there are 8 blocks. Each block has this structure of 4 true latent causes in it. And this is a little bit of a busy slide, but you see here, this is the first trial in this block. So on the x-axis is the number of spikes, and on the y-axis is the length of the spike. So this is a microbe with relatively few spikes that are relatively long. And then this is the second microbe, and the third microbe, and the fourth microbe. And you can see that they're all relatively few spikes that are relatively long. And then after trial 12, it moves to the new latent cause. So still few spikes, but relatively short, not long. And then 13, 14, 15, etc., moving around in this latent cause. But once in a while, there could be a jump back. So these are the photos that went out of order. So after trial 20 here, there's 21 is one from this latent cause, and then 22 is back again to here. So we have these, and then after this latent cause, there will be this one and then this one. So the green trials here are ones where we hope, or the ground truth is that alpha, that's starting a new latent cause and saying, oh, this is a new strain. And then we have the revisit trials, the purple ones, that are important in order to see that this is not just a change process where people infer a change and they forget the old strains, but they can go and use those previous latent causes again. And so when we measure this behavior, we can count different metrics. So for instance, how many clusters do people infer? How many revisits do they identify correctly? Or how many times do they infer a revisit? It doesn't even matter what is the ground truth. And what is the cluster size on each dimension? So the length of the spikes and the number of the spikes that they will still consider to be within the same latent cause. And running the model, it's the same kind of story, and the parameters I showed you before. So we have the new cluster parameter alpha, we have the persistent parameter that is an individual parameter here, how persistent is an old latent cause. And then we have the likelihood function here is Gaussians with variance on 2 dimensions. So we ran this on very many subjects. I'm not even showing you all of them in this figure. What I want to show you here is, first of all, the split half reliability of the parameters. So if we look at all the odd blocks versus the even blocks and infer separately the parameters of the model, you see that they're pretty correlated. So it seems like what people are doing has a rhyme and a reason. It's not kind of random each time. But you can also see that there's quite a lot of individual variability sorry, here, this is not the parameters of the model. This is just counting the number of clusters, the number of revisits, etc. So you see that some people have infer a lot more clusters than others. That the ground truth is 4, but people infer, up to 20. They revisit a lot, etc. And we have similar reliability for the model parameters. And now, given our interest in psychiatry and psychopathology, we asked these subjects to also fill in a lot of self-report questionnaires about symptoms of different mental health conditions, from autism to social anxiety, PTSD, panic, everything. And so we can take all these questionnaires and do a factor analysis to figure out what are the prominent dimensions of variability across here 1,200 and some subjects. And we see that there's one dimension, one factor. The strongest factor is anxiety and depression, kind of go together. And then the second is schizotypy, mania, and disinhibition. So this is kind of a disorganized phenotype. And this is, I should say, this is the one that a priori we thought would correlate with our task, because the idea in schizophrenia, for instance, is that the concept of reality is completely shattered and not properly grouped together. And so we were expecting schizotypy to correlate with aberrant behavior in our task. The third factor here is obsessive compulsivity, and the fourth is positive affectivity overgeneralization. And here too, we had a priori hypotheses that overgeneralization, like in anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, would correlate with the opposite, with very large clusters and not very many of them. Whereas with schizotypy, we expected there to be many clusters and kind of a disorganized clusters that might overlap with each other. That's from reading the literature on categorization. And so what we see, to make a longer story short, is in our task, the most prominent associations are with the schizotypy mania disinhibition factor. And we see that people with the stronger this factor was in subjects, the more they tended to have larger clusters, so larger variants on both dimensions in their clusters. And when we look behaviorally, I hid that slide, and given time, I'm glad that I did. We look behaviorally, we also see that this factor correlates with more jumps back to previous clusters. So you can imagine a situation like this where there are lots of clusters there are clusters that are so large that they overlap, and so seeing a stimulus here might cause a person to jump back to the previous cluster, and then another stimulus here, they jump back to this one. And so there are lots of jumps there as well. Okay. 342. Assuming we only have time for one more, do you want to go to to dive more deeply into individual differences in humans, or do you want me to go to gradual extinction and how to make extinction more effective? Quick vote.
I'd like to hear about the individual differences, but I don't know if it's only me.
Let's do that. This is already published. I can tell you that the long story short is, if you make extinction more similar to acquisition, then you basically coax animals to put everything in one latent cause, and you get more effective extinction. And so you can think of this, you know what, I'll go to the summary of this, basically, that of this section, that, you know, when you want more learning, you want more dissimilarity, right? You want more prediction errors in order to get more learning. You want to show experience that's different from what you had before. Otherwise, there won't be any need for learning. But the idea here is that as dissimilarity grows, so does the probability of a new latent cause. So if you want your learning to not be of something new, but to be updating of a previous learning, for instance, you want to change a habit in your life, right? So you don't want to learn a new behavior, don't want to, you know, learn to play a new instrument, but I want to break an old habit that is not good. I've been typing with 4 fingers and I want to type with all of them, or whatever. If you have too much dissimilarity, if you also change your keyboard, you might learn how to type with all fingers on a different keyboard, but go back to your old keyboard, you'll be typing with 2 fingers. So what you want is smaller dissimilarity and slower change that will be more long lasting, because it will really change that old association. And I find this really reassuring, because now everything that I learn slowly, I'm telling myself, this is real learning. I'm actually, you know, I should wait patiently and it will change for real. Okay, sorry. So why do some memories persist despite extinction in some people and not in others? And so this is really thinking about anxiety. So anxious beliefs are often maintained through avoidance of contrary evidence. If someone thinks that something is really scary or really going to be aversive, they just avoid that altogether. So they don't have the prediction error they don't experience it and see that, oh, it's not that bad and I shouldn't be anxious about it. So that's a really clear mechanism of maintenance of anxiety. But sometimes, even despite a lot of contrary evidence, anxiety does not go away. So for instance, in exposure therapy, the most common evidence-based therapy for anxiety, you have people expose themselves to the anxiety-provoking situation. So you have social anxiety, go talk to strangers, etc. Give a talk in front of an audience and see that it's not that bad. But still, some people remain resistant to extinction, and the anxiety returns spontaneously. And we already have an answer for why this happens. We know that successful update here would be, I update that old latent cause. So I had a latent cause of light causing shock, and I want to update that to light no longer causes shock. That would be success, but an update resistant learning would be, I learn a new latent cause that causes the light without the shock. And now that old latent cause is update resistant. So the question is, in the model, what factors predict individual differences in whether you'd have a successful update or resistance to update? And one of them is kind of your prior over latent causes before you've ever seen them. So do you believe that a latent cause is a kind of deterministic all or none thing? Like if it causes shocks, it causes shocks all the time. If my friends are going to laugh at me, they're going to laugh at me every time I talk to them. Or they're never going to laugh at me. It's like either nothing or all of it. So this is what's called in psychology or in psychotherapy, all or none thinking. It's a cognitive bias that many people have to different degrees. Versus believing that things are pretty stochastic, and some things, a certain latent cause can sometimes cause aversive events, sometimes not. It's still that same latent cause. And so in this kind of individual difference, you see that if you model it, that the deterministic prior will basically, in extinction, it has no choice but to create a new latent cause, because that old latent cause, if it caused shocks and now it doesn't, then it must be something new. So this model infers, these are trials here, one latent cause for the before extinction, and then sometime after extinction, it infers a new latent cause. And you can see that learning is very quick, but we know this is not going to be long lasting. This is an update resistant learning here. Whereas on this side, on the stochastic side, you might still, so there's a much smaller probability of inferring the new latent cause because the new observation, the observation of no shock, is still more likely under the old latent cause. This model in general prefers to not infer latent causes if it doesn't have to. So here, it basically assumes the same latent cause all throughout. So learning is much slower and extinction is slower, but it'll be more long lasting. So this is one dimension. The second dimension is looking at the prior on persistence of latent cause, or the parameter for persistence of latent causes. And here too, you might imagine different beliefs learned or inferred, however they are, kind of at the higher level, about whether the world is volatile, unpredictable, new things can happen at any point in time, versus things tend to be very persistent. And here actually it goes in the opposite direction than I would have guessed. In the model, if you infer volatility, you actually have successful updating. And if you have a prior of persistency, then you're more resistant to extinction. And the reason is that when things change abruptly here, well, when things change abruptly in both models, there's a probability a new latent cause is inferred transiently. Here, in the resistance side, that new latent cause, because of the persistence parameter, it sticks and it accounts for everything from then on. Whereas in the volatile environment, there's little support for that new latent cause to stick, because the old latent cause has caused so many trials so far. The new one is responsible just for a few events. So it kind of becomes half-half which one is really causing the next trial and the next trial. And over time, new latent cause doesn't get enough support, and you get one latent cause that accounts for all the learning. So this is in theory. We also started testing this, and this is very new data. We just did a very standard fear conditioning task. This is online, so our aversive event is a scream. It's like, ah, it sounds way worse than what I did right now. So people see a stimulus and they hear the scream 50% of the time for one stimulus, 0% of the time for the other. So this is the CS plus and the CS minus, if you want, in that jargon. These are interleaved, and we ask them on some of the trials to rate how likely do they think they will hear the scream. This is our conditioned response, because this is all from remotely we can't measure their actual skin conductance or anything like that. And what we see is that on average, people learn to differentiate. So this is the CS plus and the CS minus. So they're expecting a scream after the CS plus. They're not expecting a scream after the CS minus. And then in extinction, that expectation decreases over time for the CS plus. And then on day 2, we ask them to come back. We continue the extinction. We basically do an extinction test, and we see that they still expect more screams for the CS plus, but it's a lot less than here. And then we have relearning. And I want to focus on what happened at the end of extinction and then the test on the day 2, but I'm going to divide our subject. This is, we had 53 subjects on day 2 coming back to the experiment. I'm going to divide them to what I call the stochastic and the deterministic participants. So the all or none deterministic ones and the more stochastic ones, based on how they differentiate between the CS plus and the CS minus. So people who strongly differentiate in learning on the CS plus and CS minus, I've called them here deterministic. You can think of them as having 2 latent causes for the CS plus and the CS minus. And these people seem to really merge the 2 together, maybe kind of like mostly 1 latent cause accounting for the experiment and a little bit of a difference between them. And the interesting thing is if you look at the deterministic participants, they were afraid of the CS plus this much, between 1 and 2 at the end of day 1. Day 2, they're back up to 5, 6. So a lot of spontaneous recovery of fear. These are the people who have more latent causes. So they don't have the successful unlearning, whereas these folks here have, they learned more slowly, like I showed you in the model, but they finish here at 3 and they start here at 3 or 3 and a bit. So almost no spontaneous recovery. So that's it. That's a story. So the idea is, if we think of learning as generalization, there's a lot of work on reinforcement learning, basal ganglia, dopamine, but all of that talks about once you've already decided what's in the pile, like what's in the latent cause, how do you update within that latent cause? What I've been focused on today and in general in my lab is this process of representation learning, of deciding where are the boundaries, what should go into one cluster, and then reinforcement learning applied within that cluster, and what goes into a different cluster. And we have some neural work on it, but I didn't think that would be the most interesting for you. And in fact, for me, the behavior is way more interesting as well. So that's it. And here we are without our masks. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. This was very interesting. So I'm not sure who was first, Kinevet or Ori. So decide.
Should I stop sharing?
Sorry,
I'll stop sharing.
I thought it was a question.
No, actually, if you can go back, I'm still not sure that I got the distinction that you got between, you have the stochastic.
Yes.
I'm talking to distract you guys. I'm talking to.
Yeah, I was trying to get to the slides. You saw me trying to cancel my 3:20 p.m. appointment today that I totally scheduled without remembering that I'm giving this talk. So you wanted the difference between these two?
The difference, so I understand the stochastic versus deterministic, and you had the volatile versus persistent.
So here, the model is the same model that I showed you before with a parameter of how likely. So on each trial with p-stay, you stay with the same latent cause. You don't even draw from the Chinese restaurant process. You just stay in the same latent cause. This is the prior for that observation.
Like I guess in our terms, it's like the probability of inertia.
Of what?
Inertia. So
inertia, yes. And with 1 minus p, stay, you draw from the Chinese restaurant process, which might still decide to so it's that equation of the Chinese restaurant process times 1 minus p stay, and then add p stay to the current latent cause. That's the prior. The likelihood is still the same likelihood as before. And so if p stay is very high, very close to 1, that's the persistent model. And if it's low, then that's the volatile model. I mean, if it's 0, then it's just the regular Chinese restaurant process. That's what we model as the volatile. And the thing is, when we first thought of this model, we thought, oh, it really explains extinction, because in extinction, you generate a new latent cause. But this is like the cautionary tale of what you think is going to happen before you actually model it. When you actually draw from the Chinese restaurant process, it doesn't start a new latent cause. I mean, it does, it starts it, but it immediately abandons it because there's kind of no reason, there's so much support. And again, here in the animal work, they do 3 trials of acquisition. Here we're modeling the same number of acquisition trials in extinction. And in our task, we also had many trials of acquisition. So when there's so much support for one latent cause, with the regular Chinese restaurant process, it just continues. It's very hard. That's because it's not a change process. If it was a real change model, it would be something else. We were thinking of it as a change model, but in reality, it's not a change model, and it just infers one latent cause throughout. I mean, there is some small probability. There is another latent cause and even a third. I mean, the truth, it's in 40 trials, there will be 40 latent causes, but most of them have vanishing probability. The one main one takes most of the probability. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and the stochastic and deterministic is a different parameter, right? So
the stochastic and deterministic was when you start a new latent cause, you have to have a prior. So here, this is our likelihood here is a binomial distribution, right? Because either you get a scream or you don't. So it's not a Gaussian, and there is a prior on that binomial. And so the question is does the prior look like this? So people had previously modeled this as a flat prior. Everybody assumed that the prior is flat. It doesn't have to be flat, it could be anything. So actually in these graphs, the flat prior is the gray one that I'm showing here. And then the black is this kind of prior, a side heavy prior. And the black here is a middle heavy prior. So you can have whatever prior.
It's more than one parameter, right? So it's the distribution.
It's a beta distribution, so it has 2 parameters.
2 parameters for the distribution, okay.
Yeah, but since we model it as, in this case, we modeled it as 1 parameter because it's symmetric. So it's beta with the same parameter twice. The question is it smaller than 1 is what you see here, or larger than 1, which is what you see here.
Cool, thank you. And the result that you said that you've been in the hospital. Okay, so I will give other people to ask. Maybe I can ask you later. Sorry.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for this great talk. Now it's the time for those who have to leave to leave. And if it's fine with you, we'll stay for some more time with additional questions.
Absolutely.
So for example, Koti have to leave, so bye, Koti. Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can ask something. We have this result that, but I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I will say it anyway. So we have the result that show we have this task similar to your second task that that you see high and low value with different distribution. So we have a task like that, and we study both how people evaluate the average, in our case, and then what they are going to choose. And we found the difference. So when they evaluate the average, they appear to exhibit what Kahneman called the peak end effect, that is high sensitivity to the extremes. Whereas in choice, they behave as if they're underweight rare event. So which is basically the opposite. And we capture it with the idea that people rely on small samples. So if they rely on small sample, the models that assume reliance on small samples imply that almost no bias on the average.
Sorry, just a second.
Yeah, that's okay.
Mably? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, he went to the theme at the wrong time.
So basically, is your model predict agreement between estimating the average and choice rate? Because that will be a way to distinguish it between our model.
Well, so I'm now thinking of this in a different way. So it doesn't have to be, so I was thinking before, do you choose between this school and this school? But if I had to choose, do I want to sample this side or this side? Do I want to sample the stingy or the generous? And obviously I would, I mean, basically, if I'm predicting what's going to happen what's going to be more likely on the next trial, right? A choice is about what's going to happen next. I will predict the more likely. I will predict that here the next trial will be generous, and here the next trial will be sparse. It will be stingy. Whereas what I asked them was not to predict the next trial, but to tell me the average of all the previous trials.
No,
I think we would be.
Reaction.
Yeah, I think we would be, if
but
it's a completely different question.
If you would ask them to predict, like now we're gonna, I don't know, if you choose a school, so you're gonna, like for 100 trial, you have one of these distribution. Which one you prefer?
So it's not which one do you prefer, it's which latent cause do you think is going to cause the next trial. And here, definitely you would think that the latent cause that will cause the next trial is the generous one. And here you'll think that the latent cause that will cause the next trial is the stingy one. So, if I'm collecting donations, I'd rather collect from this school, even though I assume that its average is less than 150, I'd rather collect from this school because I'm gonna get a generous donation. Whereas here, I assume that on average, they gave me more than 150, but I'd still not want to collect from that school because the next one is going to be, this is still the largest latent cause here.
But then, so the option to distinguish between our prediction would be, if I'm asking you, what do you want, not the next trial, not what will be the latent.
Which of the schools completely,
the school you want to choose.
So a whole bundle of latent causes, right? So, which colleague do you want to go to lunch with? Exactly. The one that's mostly been nice, but did a few bad things, or the one that's mostly been annoying, mildly annoying, but did a few very good things? Which one do you want to go to lunch with? That's your question, really. So yeah, we haven't asked that question. I don't know if you have asked that question, Ido.
Yeah, we asked that question. I'll send you the paper. We didn't ask exactly that question, but with something related, I'll send you the paper.
Sure, great.
It's really interesting. Well, to relate it to the possibility of have some effect on psychiatry, this is really amazing. And it's a little bit related to the old literature on how do you say, on battle shock and stuff. So it's consistent.
Yeah, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea that the old idea that you should keep people in the same area because it's similar, and then you do the extinction there. So you have a justification for this old belief.
Well, yeah, it depends. So a long time ago, my sister, when she just started driving, she had a car accident in the rain. And the first thing my dad did, she total loss for that car. He took her in the other car and he said, let's drive over there to see if everybody else is okay. This was close to home. You drive. And he made her drive in the rain, in the dark, in the same. And he was like, this is important, so she doesn't now stop driving for the rest of her life. So I think, yes, that is a very useful treatment. Of course, someone who's had a horrible traumatic event, the war, rape, etc. You won't say, let's get you almost raped so you can, have a good outcome. So there are all kinds of ethical considerations there, but the most effective treatment for PTSD is what's called prolonged exposure. And in prolonged exposure, what you do is you have people in their imagination expose themselves to the stimulus, but really to the event, but really in present tense. So they're sitting in an office and the therapist's job is to both remind them that they're safe, but also take them as close to the actual event that they can get. Really, they're speaking in present tense and ask them, and what do you feel? And what do you smell? And what do you see? And really bring them to there. And it's prolonged exposure because they record it and they listen to it every day. And next week they record it again and they listen to it every day. And they do this for 6 weeks. And it's amazing. You have people who for 60 years have lived with trauma, have avoided, it's affected their life in many ways. They avoid many things. They avoid crowds. They don't go to the mall. They don't leave the house. They can't get on a bus, whatever. And 6 weeks of this, and it's gone. It's really magical, but it involves, and like every other treatment, it doesn't work for everybody, but it works. It's the one that works the best, and it really involves going into that memory, being there, and experiencing that you're safe. So it's kind of like this, yeah.
Right.
That's very impressive. We have a question in the chat. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. It's from Duyago, and she's asking, what do you think about the role of attention for successful updating? Because we know attention enhances the representation of memories. It can affect updating relativity. Do you think that the level of attention may influence successful updating?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about attention. One thing that's not exactly what you're asking is that attention, I think, is really important for determining how we calculate similarity, right? If we attend to the thing that is more, so if I'm attending to color, then my similarity function will be all the things that were a similar color. If I'm ignoring color, then similarity might not depend on that dimension. And that relates to other work that I did in the past, and Kinneret and Ido know this work, and others maybe here.
It's maybe Ori's work.
Sorry?
It was
Ori was the first author.
No, I'm saying we did work on this.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. On attention to different dimensions. But you're asking attention to memories. In general, I think all of these cognitive processes work exactly the same on the real world as they do in our memory. So when I'm drawing from memory, again, the dimensions that I'm attending to in my memory determine where I'm drawing from. So I think, and this is a speculation only, I think that what we attend to when we're experiencing things determines how we classify them, what latent cause, et cetera, and so where we store them in memory. So what they're closest to, what's easiest to, what things make it easier to, what's it called? Lishlof et hazikaron. Why am I suddenly forgetting? To retrieve that memory, but also we might look farther away, with our attention spotlight in our memory. Like I was trying now for this word, it suddenly went away, right? And we're not only looking close to the current situation, but we can look far away. So I think attention has a huge role here, both in how we store things and how we retrieve them. Absolutely. And then you might also be asking about the general level of attention, am I attending to this task at all? And that's a whole other, the kind of level of arousal, that's a whole other dimension that I don't think about that much. But obviously, if you're not attending to things and you're not putting them in memory, and you have less likelihood of retrieving them in the future as well.
Do you think, Yael, that there is different types, like in the hierarchical kind of way, different types of latent variables that are changing in a different way?
What do you mean?
I'm referring again, we mentioned this work. So Ori Plonsky and me, together with me and Ido, we had this work about regularities and pattern seeking, that people look for patterns. And I wonder, in your framework of latent variables, might it be that you have some kind of beliefs about which latent variables will come in about regularity? So this would be a higher hierarchy kind of.
Absolutely.
That navigate between the latent variables, right?
Well, it's a hard, so here we have latent causes causing events, but they're kind of like uber latent causes causing events. And you can, I don't know, how many layers deep you need to go, but there are contexts within contexts, right? There is, how I behave at work when I'm in my office versus when I'm in the seminar room, when I'm talking to this person versus that person. All of these are within the context of when I'm at work. I can be in the same place when I'm not at work, like, on a Saturday when I come in with my kids to pick something up, and I might behave completely differently. I might dress differently. A lot of things will be different. And so I think, we have this very wrong idea that we are one person. We all have multiple selves in different contexts, even different, when you're tired, you behave differently. When you're hungry, you behave differently than when you're not. And it obviously, all of these groupings matter for how you evaluate things, for what is your action policy. You can have very different action policies for the same exact stimuli in different contexts. So that's kind of why I said maybe in the beginning that I think the more I think about it, the more I'm like, it's so obvious, this concept of latent causes, this grouping, these contexts. It's there all the time, and it determines everything that we do. How it determines our learning and our behavior so strongly that it's almost like we discovered the obvious. We didn't discover it. We put an equation on it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Uri, you had a question before, right?
Yeah. Hi, thanks for talk. I had a question about I think one of the last the last experiment. There is this interesting the bump in the after the extinction. You have even in the unlearned thing, you have like this increase.
Intense recovery, yeah.
Like in this after the reversal. So this is we are trying to do something like a very similar paradigm, and we observe a lot of individual differences in this bump. So actually, we try how much for example, we try to think about it as some people think that if one thing changes for the worse, everything changed for the worst, and or they ignore it, or it goes, they just don't know what's going on. And I really like this, the two clusters that you showed. So how much, what do you think about this small bump? Is it of interest, or?
Well, that's yeah. It definitely is a thing that we're interested in, the extent to which the old fear, in our case, resurfaces. It turns out that a lot of it is not because, so again, this is kind of the difference between how we armchair understand our model and when we actually model the model. So we thought, okay, it's the old latent cause coming back and causing fear, but actually a lot of it is just inferring a completely new latent cause because it's a new day. So we see that the people who have spontaneous recovery, they recover to basically the amount of fear that they expressed in the very first trial on the first day. They're just, new day. I started new. So that's a big part of it. And so you have different parameters here interacting. So you have the alpha of, creating a new latent cause when it's a new day. And then you have the persistence and the two parameters that I showed, the persistence and the probabilities for a new latent cause also playing a role here. And we're definitely interested in all of these individual variability parameters. Again, going back to the clinic, I think in many psychopathologies, it's clear that flexibility is a good thing. People who are not flexible in their learning and their understanding of the world have more psychopathology. And a lot of therapy is aimed at just increasing your flexibility. Just, put question marks where you have exclamation marks in your explanations, in your internal explanations of the world. You can't imagine how many times I've said that to my patients. Just add a question mark. Right? It's all about adding flexibility. And I really like to be able to formalize what that means. And I think some of these individual differences have to do with that. Like how flexible am I to put within my current model of the world new things versus having to say, okay, this, new rules, new everything, blah, 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 we start anew. That's inflexible. Even though it creates many latent causes, it's inflexible in some sense.
But it reduces your class evaluation, this question marks.
Sorry?
Students want you to, it reduces your class evaluation. Student wants professor that knows exactly the correct answer. There's no question mark in the end.
But in psychopathology,
like it.
In psychopathology, it's very, you know, you think everybody's laughing at me. Are they laughing at me? Maybe they're laughing about something else. Maybe someone else told a joke. Yeah, you add a question mark and immediately all the anxiety comes from my interpretation of the world in one way with an exclamation mark after it. If you add question marks, everything is more relaxed.
Cool.
What do you think about people with high conspiracy scale?
Oh, we have
that too. So many exclamation marks there, right?
No exclamation mark.
No, I would say the other way around. It's more like your schizo scale because it might have less latent variable. Everything is connected, right? So everything is
coherent.
Well, these guys don't have question marks. They know exactly everything.
But this is your prior with the two options and the more non-informative prior. I think this is like something that we also see. Like it happens in delusion, like in schizophrenia and stuff like this, sense of reality. The notion that you can play with this, just like how strong your prior is, and it's important for it to be strong enough and not to be flat. So if you have flat, you are really in a big problem because everything shifts all the time, and you can really play with these parameters. So yeah, so I think, and one thing that I just going back to the question of the, so we also play with different dimensions, like different priors or different assumptions that people have. So someone can have like a very different priors or different latent beliefs about latent causes for different scenarios, or different, I don't know, dimensions of reality. Some things can change, but some things are not, are fixed. So, and you can learn these kind of like, you can just teach people that the world shifts between two options and see if you really change their, like differentiate between different types of these inconsistencies. So, and this is something that we're trying to do as well, like trying to see what kind of things people think are fixed and what things are much more flexible. So just like, I know, just taking advantage of these already kind of priors that people have, trying to reframe the problem, the learning problem in different kind of context, using different beliefs. You can already see how people, I don't know, have different beliefs about these things. Yeah. Well, cool.
Okay, unless we have any additional questions, two quick questions from me. One is a technical one. How do you ensure in the online experiments that they do listen to this annoying sound? Because I will assume that if I am participating, I will just turn off my speaker.
We work hard on this. So they have to have earphones. We have tests in the beginning when we say something only in one ear, and if they don't know which ear, then you know, they can't continue. And then we have them set the volume. We speak very quietly and we say, you know, if you hear this very well, then your volume is too high. And we get them to set the volume. In one case, like they have to hear something, and so they have to set it higher. And then in another case, we try to make sure it's not too high, because one of the subjects in the very beginning complained that his ears were ringing for hours after the experiment. We're like, why didn't you just turn off the volume? But okay, we've only had that complaint once. And then during the experiment, at random times, we say quietly, please press the letter F now, or please press the letter whatever. And if they don't do it, then we know that they've turned off the volume, and we throw out the subject's data. So
I guess you had a hard time with the IRB for the Yanning screening kind of.
Yeah, no, it was fine. They were fine. We what we do after this, that person who complained very bitterly, we actually play the scream and the start, and we say, you're going to hear this a bunch of times, so make sure it's aversive but not too terrible, don't and
the last question for today, for this great talk, any tips for multitasking? Just because
What do you
I saw
mean?
that you were great at listening and looking at the chat and answering the questions, it was a joke.
You know that the people who think that they're best at multitasking are actually worse at it. So yeah, no, all of us are bad at multitasking. And if you think that you're good at it, then you're not. Yeah. It also anti-correlates with age. So no, I was answering that, but I might have not heard you at that point.
Yeah, and maybe with gender, you might have to change your gender if you want. But nowadays you can do it.
So you think
Yeah.
that you're young, right? Because if
Well,
you're young,
you know, it's very interesting to think about the hormonal effects on. I just heard a few talks at GEHA by transgender people who so many things change with hormone therapy. I wonder if also multitasking changes. It's amazing how strong these hormones are in determining so many aspects of our lives.
Interesting.
Yes, and on this interesting note, I think unless there are any, Ida, you wanted to comment something?
No.
Oh.
No, he was just saying bye.
Say hi, yes.
Thank you so much. This was a great, thought-provoking talk.
Oh, I have a question for you. I have to have it correctly in my notes. Was this all, except for Kinneret, of course, but this was Technion or also Haifa University? I was unsure who invited me.
No.
Which department?
Kind of our group invited you, which is Kinneret, Ori, Ido, and myself. And Ido, go ahead with the answer.
No, but the conference is international. It's open for the whole world, and you get people from mostly from Europe.
I think you asked who organized it, right?
This
really
actual seminar. Is this a Technion seminar or is this a Haifa University seminar?
Yefim is from University of Haifa, and we are, in the Technion. So.
Okay, so it's your local group. Okay, I just want to know because I have a list so that when I'm invited to give another talk, I don't give the same exact talk to the same people. So I wanted to know.
So you are doing your similarity function. You have your list of things that you know exactly how to update them.
I have no memory, so I have to rely on a lot of tactics. That yeah, a lot of writing things down.
I'm trying to do that too. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
It was very good to see you.
Great to see you.
Bye.
Bye. Enjoy your time in ציונה. כנרת, את תשלחי לי לינק למחר?
תקשיב רגע, אם עידו כבר פה, אז אני יכולה... רגע, קודם כל תוריד את ההקלטה.
רגע, אני אוריד את ההקלטה.